Welcome to Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. I'm your host, Dr. Alan Christianson. Look, you know that between the latest online fads and the crazy media headlines, it's easier than ever to get confused about your health. And you and I just want to feel better and live longer. We want to know what works. And we can't wait for further studies. We need to make decisions today based on the best evidence we've got. Well, that's exactly what this show is here for. So let's get to it. Hey, Dr. C here with you. So you've heard me talk about the importance of protein for your health. And then we hear about how the types of protein we consume, especially beef, may be creating havoc for the environment. So what's a person to do? Well, the benefits of protein for health are pretty clear. They don't have to come from beef or even from animals. But the idea about animal proteins and beef especially being an issue for the environment, I have a lot of mixed feelings about that. I want to make sure that what we do will be sustainable and will be conducive to long-term health of the planet as well as us individually. I read a book recently called Sacred Cow. This was written by Robb and Diana Rogers. So Robb, he's a research biochemist, New York Times bestselling author, and he put this book together which explains how well-raised meat can actually be good for the planet. It can have a positive environmental impact. Robb has helped hundreds of thousands of people better understand health issues and improve their lives because of that. He does a really good job distilling information, making complicated stuff easier to understand, basically. And I really enjoyed this talk with Robb. He's someone I've known and admired a lot of his work. And it's something that I feel like there's a lot to understand here, and it may not be a simple cut and dry issue. So please enjoy this discussion about the effect of beef on the environment with Robb. Hey, Dr. C here with you, and I'm really happy to be joined with Robb. I've followed Robb's work for some time, been aware of him. This is the first time connecting in person, so I'm enjoying that already. And the occasion of this is Robb's got a newer book out called The Sacred Cow, Case for Better Meat, Why Well-Raised Meat is Good for You and Good for the Planet. And I really want to talk through beef especially, animal protein, but especially beef, and the relevant effects upon human health and environmental health. So Robb, welcome to the podcast.
Doc, it's a huge honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to throw some of my biases out on the table, so we're clear about that. And for the health discussion, early on in my journey, I was trying to find ways to, feel better, be healthier. I gained a lot of weight as a young kid. I did better with that. But as an older teen, I fell into a lot of food fads. I didn't really have the background in nutrition or a background in critical thinking at the time to make sense of things. So when I read books telling me that, I would basically gain superpowers if I restricted my diet a whole lot, I thought that sounded cool. I wanted superpowers.
Who doesn't? Yeah.
It seemed like for a while, anything I would try, I would feel so much better from. And now I would think about that more of a placebo effect, more than anything. But then the more restrictive my diets were, the more my health suffered. And I just, I tried so many iterations, but I couldn't escape the conclusion that I needed a broader variety of foods. So that's my bias. I'm an omnivore. I do eat beef. I eat poultry. I eat seafood. I feel better on those things. And I've looked a lot at the medical literature. So I want to first talk about just, what are the health implications? Is someone risking their health by including these foods in the diet? So yeah, let's dive into that part of it first.
Man, a really good question. And, this is something that I think people are assailed daily. Every time they your Apple news feed or Yahoo news feed or what have you. Gosh, there was just something the other day that like a slice of bacon was supposed to increase your risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes by something, a slice of bacon a day by like 25% or something. Like it was worse than drinking soda. And we're just kind of barraged with stuff like this. And you can dig through the headline and get to a paper, and the paper is peer reviewed, and it has oftentimes from some august institution like Yale or Harvard or something like that, and it looks really legit. And I'm a biochemist by training, did cancer and autoimmunity research. So I feel like I've got chemistry is kind of cool in that it's the middle ground between like the really hard science of physics and mathematics, engineering, and kind of bridges into biology and whatnot. But man, it doesn't take any effort at all to get me out over the tips of my skis. And I'm in an area that I don't understand. I'm very good at metabolism and organic chemistry. I'm rather puny when it comes to genetics and understanding all the myriad of polymorphisms. So it's really easy to get into deep water on these different topics. But when we dig into the research that looks at these claims around consuming animal products and their assumed deleterious effects on health, it's really important to understand the qualitative nature of these studies. They're almost universally these retrospective studies that rely on food frequency questionnaires. And one of the most egregious examples that I've seen in this, it was a study that was out maybe 2 years ago, and we talk about it a lot in Sacred Cow, received a ton of fanfare. This thing asked people to remember what they had eaten 1 year ago, 6 years ago, and 12 years ago.
Wow.
And there's it is so crystal clear, one, that folks have terrible memories. Like human beings just have terrible memories. Like if you do perhaps some of the best examples of this are when there have been videotaped examples of, say, like a car accident or a
Mm.
crime, and we have objective validation of what really happened, and then when people are interviewed about what they remember happening, it's like they were on a different planet. Like it doesn't match up to what the video representation is at all. So people have terrible memories. People tend to lie, and not necessarily for nefarious reasons, but they're kind of like, oh, this scientist is asking me how I eat, so I'm going to report the way that more the way that I think that they want me to report. And really interesting researcher guy by the name of John Ioannidis has made the case
Mm.
that there is more error in these studies than there is signal
Yeah.
as a baseline, that you really it's difficult to make the case that there is anything in this. And I think that one of the problems that we face, these kind of large epidemiological based studies, these things became incredibly popular because they were really what cracked open the whole smoking linkage to lung cancer. And in that case, the linkage between smoking and lung cancer was this hazard ratio that was incredibly powerful. It was like 200. And if you don't get something that is in the tens or 20s, then it's probably just random noise. As not to get too far out in the weeds on the kind of statistical side, but when we I know I'm kind of casting around here, but here's a pretty good example of the way that this stuff gets handled. As a baseline, anybody in a westernized society right now has about a 5% chance of developing colon cancer at some point in their life. Doesn't matter what else you have going on. Just anybody that lives in a modern westernized society, there's about a 5% risk of developing colon cancer. In theory, according to these studies that I'm talking about, where they ask you, what did you eat last week, last month, last year, last decade, uh, when the researchers get in and kind of torture the data and look at how much bacon, how much red meat people are reporting or whatnot, in theory, according to that, the risk of daily red meat and or processed meat consumption takes your absolute risk from 5% to 6%. And again, this is assuming that this data isn't just absolute garbage, which I kind of think that it is. But the way that this gets reported is that red meat consumption increases colon cancer risk by 20%, because the difference between 5 and 6 is 18%, and why not round up to 20? And when we really get in and dig into the bulk of the literature on these types of studies, this is what we find. Like there's some really at the very beginning, the quality of the data itself is highly questionable. The kind of hazard ratios and the p values, like how powerful this data is very, very, very low. Something that isn't well appreciated. T. Colin Campbell, the author of the China study, he published a number of different papers suggesting that meat consumption was correlated with increased cancer risk. What isn't well appreciated is that he didn't publish the correlation between wheat consumption and cancer. And wheat has a higher correlation than meat does with various types of cancers, but that remained unpublished. Still could be garbage in there, but it's just kind of worth mentioning that there are all kinds of different relationships there. So let's give these guys the benefit of the doubt and say that there is some sort of relationship there. It ends up being tiny, 5% versus 6%. So 5 people out of 100 versus 6 people out of 100. And the 6 people out of 100, this was assuming that you had daily red meat or processed meat intake your whole life. And it increased it by an absolute risk value of 1%.
I
But
think
it
it was
gets
about
reported
100
as
grams or more
20%.
per day, or
Yeah, yeah, it was a non-trivial amount of red or processed meat. So I think that this is kind of a beginning point of kind of unpacking these claims around the consumption of meat products. And one of the big challenges that we have is that it's so expensive to put large numbers of people into basically a metabolic ward setting where we know exactly how much and what types of food they're eating and tracking them over long periods of time. People don't like living that way. It's very, very expensive. So we have these epidemiological studies as kind of, I guess, the best fallback. But I don't. They've been criticized to a degree that some have suggested that we just shouldn't do them at all anymore because it's not actually answering any types of questions. But it's
well, in
worth men.
epidemiology in general, I would argue that it certainly has all the flaws you mentioned, and with that, it's not meaningless. It's not high quality. It's not that useful when there's not strong effect sizes, but there's something there. But even with the largest studies, yeah, taking them at face value, even there's not a strong case to be made. It's things like you're saying, to where if there is an effect size, it's something that, how much is that relative to just total food consumption? How much of that is
Mhm.
offset by plant intake, how much of that is halo effect from other lifestyle habits. So yeah.
Yeah, and to that point, I'm glad you mentioned that because I'd kind of forgotten about this. The healthy user bias is a pretty big deal in this, and so not to overly throw the epidemiological studies under the bus, but there was an interesting study performed where they looked at folks who only shopped at kind of like a Whole Foods or a health food store type scenario, which you kind of assume that those folks are generally living a broadly healthier lifestyle. They tend to smoke less, they do meditation, and on and on. And what we found in those circumstances is that the folks that consumed animal products actually had a longer overall lifespan. So,
Mhm.
and again, is this just, you mentioned having biases at the beginning. Am I just kind of picking and choosing biases? Probably, but the data is there, and so it's not crystal clear one way or the other. But when we do shorter term interventions, where we look at the metabolic effects of people consuming an animal product inclusive diet, we don't see markedly elevated inflammatory markers, systemic oxidative stress, and whatnot, like all the kind of mechanistic hallmarks that we would associate with cancer. We don't see dramatic negative effects in the gut microbiota, as just kind of a standalone piece. So and also if we just take one step back, and this is where I think this kind of ancestral health model is really powerful. When we look at pre-westernized cultures that eat a variety of diets, but all of them include animal products, we see a stunning decrease in the chronic degenerative diseases that you and I see every day. And again, this isn't proof, but it's strongly suggestive that maybe there's a problem with the highly processed modern Western diet, and in particular, the kind of hyper palatable food environment that we live in. Once people start overeating food in general, I think that that's really where the problem lies. And once we get people to a spot where they figure out how to spontaneously regulate their food intake to match their relative physical activity and whatnot, then kind of magic happens. It's really avoiding that overeating scenario that appears to be the biggest driver, in my opinion, of what is happening here.
And I think there's some really robust data around the impact of protein on satiety. When we think
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
protein, I tell my vegan friends and readers that, yes, you'll not get protein deficient. That's not so much a worry if you're getting enough food. But there's a point at which, when protein's below some threshold, satiety changes and metabolism
Yeah.
changes. And there's abundant foods from all sources that contain adequate amounts of protein for survival value. When you consider protein as a relative contributor of calories, it's pretty tough to be at a quarter or a third without either a very narrow diet or some animal protein included.
Yep, yep, and this alludes to the, protein leverage hypothesis. It makes
Yeah.
the case that it all organisms on the planet, tend to eat to a protein minimum, and whether you're talking about grazing animals that would prefer clover over grass or omnivorous animals that will go for more protein-rich sources, in general, when we find protein-rich foods, we tend to see more nutrition per calorie in that scenario, and so the body doesn't really sense many nutrients. Sodium is one of the interesting ones. Like it will really, keep a pretty close eye on that, but also total protein or amino acid intake. And in general, once people hit that kind of protein minimum, then they spontaneously tend to not overeat. And we've seen this whether high carb side of the story or low carb side of the study. This is where some people in the ketogenic diet world, out of fear of things like mTOR and IGF-1s and cancer and cardiovascular disease, they eat a really low protein diet and they end up gaining weight on ketogenic diets that are mainly fat, and they're just kind of stupefied that this ketogenic diet that's supposed to be virtually impossible to gain weight on, they end up gaining significant amounts of weight and seeing the associated health problems. But what I've noticed is that if people undereat protein in general, then they will tend to overeat everything else. And in Sacred Cow, we did several different analyses where we looked at the common protein rich vegan sourced food items, and also kind of the food combining, and just across the board. And this was actually fleshed out in it wasn't a World Health Organization, but it was an organization kind of under their auspice. But they made the case that completely shifting animal products out of the general diet would lead to both nutrient deficiencies and all kinds of obesity and overeating related issues, because people will tend to eat more food. Like they really acknowledge this protein leverage kind of perspective on all that.
And I certainly have seen some that seem to do well on vegan plant-based diets, and there's a lot of reasons apart from health that one could do that. But yeah, there are those that do not, and these are a lot of reasons for that. You brought up the mTOR model, and I'd love to go a little deeper into that on the relative thoughts about longevity. There are many that talk about, yeah, this goal of protein sparing as a way to possibly achieve longevity. And I see a couple things that just come up to me as far as high level perspectives is differentiating data from human outcome studies versus data from mechanistic models or animal studies, and also differentiating lifespan from health span. So yeah, I just love some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm pretty contrarian on this. Like I did my first published article on intermittent fasting and the potential around health span, lifespan, and enhancement back in 2005. And by 2006, I regretted releasing that article because people had just gone bananas on it. It was really at that point, I was fairly well known within the CrossFit scene. And if CrossFitters are known for anything, it's excess. And so if 16 hours of fasting is good, wouldn't 22 hours of fasting be even better? And I'll dovetail that on top of 6 workouts a day and 5 grams of carbohydrate a month. And, it was kind of a disaster. But when I really started, I've been tracking this stuff for a long time, but I really started digging into this claim around calorie restriction, nutrient restriction, and longevity. There's a great paper. I'll ping it to you. You may have already seen it, but calorie restriction does not improve longevity in all animals and may shorten it in others. And it was a real deep dive on this topic, and there's very few examples of feeding organisms a species appropriate diet and introducing caloric restriction, but there are a few of them out there. And what's interesting is that in the examples where, say, like a mouse was fed an actual mouse diet, like mealworms and grains and nuts
Hmm.
and just actually what
So
a
not rat
rodent would
chow.
forage, not rat chow. What they found is that in these calorie restricted species appropriate models, lifespan was shortened, and
Mm.
non-trivially, it was significantly shortened. And when as I cast around in this, what I came away from this was that these rat chow based diets, it's tough because nutrition trying to be scientific. So the problem with this species appropriate diet is the researchers didn't know exactly how much protein, carbs, fat that these mice were eating. They would kind of get an approximation, and they would weigh it, and allow the animals to eat all that, and then they would just assume that that's everything that they ate. Doing a highly processed rat chow based diet, you've got like whey protein and some palm oil, and you've got some sort of a refined carbohydrate. So in that really reductionist nutritional science perspective, it improves the accuracy and precision because we
Mm.
know exactly how much is there. But what are we feeding these critters? A remarkably highly processed diet. I mean, it's kind of like the worst things that you could pull out of the junk food aisle of a supermarket. And what I took away from this paper and others related to it is that if we are being fed a really highly processed diet, eating less of it is better than eating more of it. And that was kind of the full takeaway that I had on that. And then on these discussions of mTOR and whatnot, what's interesting there is, without a doubt, when an individual is overeating and they're chronically inflamed and their insulin levels are chronically elevated and they are awash in excess nutrients, that is absolutely a problem. mTOR is critical in growth, it's critical in immune function, and it's also likely kind of genetically programmed to be transiently on and off, during different periods of both feeding and fasting. It's worth mentioning that mTOR gets selectively turned on in muscle tissue under the situation of exercise. And so we know for sure that exercise isn't a cancer contributor. It appears to be mitigating the effects of aging and the potential of developing cancer and whatnot. So there was just something not totally adding up there. And again, I did a talk that was supposed to be kind of my main talk for 2020, but COVID hit, and hardly anybody got to see that. And it's called "Longevity, Are We Trying Too Hard?" And so I'm going to post that for kind of general consumption. But I really lay out the case that so long as we find a protein adequate diet that allows us to not overeat, and then we eat in some sort of a pulsatile fashion, 2 meals a day, maybe 2 meals and a snack, but not chronically eating all day, not overfed. I don't see the case that this is going to really powerfully lead into accelerated aging and whatnot. And the human data on calorie restriction and the idea that it would extend human lifespan, I think, is very weak. Actually, it's humans already have a powerful selection pressure for significant longevity. Some of the background with this is called the grandmother hypothesis, and it's this thought that not just human societies, but other complex group societies like elephants and other primates, they tend to be fairly long lived, even in post reproductive years, because having a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle around that can help caretake the younglings and protect them and whatnot, and teach cultural aspects, that there's some real evolutionary value there. And I know I'm kind of casting around here, but another piece to this story is that even in the situation of mTOR, something that's often underappreciated is that we have two pieces of mTOR, mTOR complex 1 and mTOR complex 2, and both of them have complementary but in some ways antagonistic roles. And in order to mount a proper response to cancer at the immune level, we actually need mTOR complex 1 turned on at various points for the T cells and the other complements of the immune system to do what it's supposed to do to mount a response to cancer. So if we chronically suppress mTOR, we're actually setting ourselves up for cancer in many regards. So this is again where I think about it. People have reduced this incredibly complex process down to a light switch,
Yeah.
on or off. And I think about it much more. I forget exactly. I always forget this, but I think that a standard piano keyboard is 88 keys,
Hmm.
and there's literally an infinite amount of music that can be created with 88 keys. Each key can be held for longer or shorter in different patterns and whatnot. And we have 23,000 genes. So if we think about a keyboard that's 23,000 genes, keyboard keys deep, and we're going to assume that we should just turn them all on or all off, and that's going to work well. Like I think it's really it's pretty naive. So again, I don't know if I answered the question all that well, but I think that I'm definitely of the opinion that if somebody's thinking about should I add an additional day of fasting per month, I would really like to ask them, are you already doing 3 or 4 days of strength training per week? Because for all of us, it cancer, cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative disease, all of that is a potential. Like we all have some sort of a risk potential profile in that story. But all of us, it's a certainty that as we age, we will lose muscle mass. Like the
Yeah.
process of sarcopenia and loss of muscle mass is a guarantee. So I'm hard pressed to think why we wouldn't stack the deck in our favor of getting adequate protein to support lean body mass. And that also helps us to not overeat, interestingly. And then to exercise, and it doesn't have to be a frenetic exercise schedule, like a full body, circuit training workout, 2 or 3 days a week. It just has really shocking benefits. But I see folks that are so protein restricted and doing so much fasting that they look awful. They don't look like they could survive. Like if their car slid off an embankment and slid down a roadway, that they would have the strength to like extract themselves out of the car and get to safety. So I
Yeah.
really tend to side more on building resilience and a robust physical structure. And I think that in the long term, that's where our best return on investment is going to lie. But that's definitely a minority position. Like a lot of very smart people are selling this notion that like health span and lifespan are going to be dramatically improved with a significant protein restriction and fasting and whatnot.
Well, it's minority, but you're not alone. I'm with you. So yeah, so health span and lifespan, I've heard these defined as, health span, how many good years do we have? How long do
Hmm.
we avoid some level of morbidity? And then lifespan, what's possible for the genome? How far could we possibly go in ideal circumstances? And if we were at a point to where pretty much everyone is dropping dead at 119, it might be worth focusing on our lifespan. How can we possibly
Right.
extend that? But that's not the problem. That's not where we are currently. Most people are not reaching an adequate health span.
Yep.
And with me more and more, I think not even about the details of an argument, but just about the quality of the premises. What are we comparing? So in this case, the mTOR argument, it's really mechanistic. Like you said, we've got a large keyboard, we've got over 5,000 chemical pathways. And we're saying for this whole thing of our lifespan, this is the only pathway that's important. Well, that can't be the case. So that argument, there's so many ways in which that may be true, but there's more ways in which that could be untrue or even opposite. And one of the real powerful experiences for me in medical school, there was one professor, you've seen these with this wall map of biochemical pathways,
Hmm.
and he would mesmerize us by saying how coleus would act as a cyclic AMP inhibitor and walk through all these various steps. And it was pretty cool. But then he would start speculating. So, I always thought that perhaps this plant or this nutrient or this medication could act in these ways because it would start here, go there. And for a while, I was spellbound. And very quickly, I realized, wait a minute, you could go anywhere to anywhere with this. You can make up any plausible just so story that
Right.
makes a lot of sense. And when we look at the whole arc of ideas that go through the gauntlet of research and analysis and make it out to be a useful outcome, it's a few per million. Almost
Right.
all things at the idea level do not pan out. So when I see something over here that's an argument based upon a mechanism, some animal data, and then over here, all this data about human outcome studies relative to sarcopenia, muscle retention, healthy aging, fragility, chronic disease, pneumonia. This is what actually happens to people. And this is what a theory says might happen. So I don't consider those valid equal weights.
Yeah, I don't either. And to your point, it's not a super popular position, but it doesn't offer a ton of hope on the pharmaceutical side. What you and I are talking about, it doesn't offer a ton of like patentable IP protectable things. It encourages people to buy good quality protein and find the carbohydrate, amounts and types that work well with you. Maybe invest some money, park your car outside and convert part of your garage into a home gym, and then 2 or 3 days a week you get after it. And it's worth mentioning that everything that goes, and I'm not suggesting that people become amateur bodybuilders, but everything that one would do to support good muscle mass and strength throughout life, it supports good cardiovascular function, it supports good neurological function, it supports good immune function. I mean, it's interesting that you don't need to get really reductionistic. You're like, well, I'm worried about losing my marbles and I'm worried about having a heart attack. Okay, just get good muscle mass, have some decent cardiovascular performance, and just hang on to as much of that for as long as you possibly can. And that fixes virtually everything. Now, does that guarantee you will never have a heart attack, never develop a neurodegenerative disease? No. But I guarantee you, had you not been doing those things, that would have befallen you earlier. Like I'm convinced of that. And it's also along the way, and I think you alluded to this, our quality of life is outstanding along the way too. Like
Yeah.
and it's just kind of this easy one-stop shop, but it's not that sexy. There's no like, secret thing behind door number 3 or whatever. It's just like you got to lift some weights, do a little bit of interval training, and do a variety of movement, and then fuel yourself in a way that really supports that process.
I had our daughter's adult. She's moved out, and she was over last night. And we're talking about things, and I mentioned how you ever play shoots and ladders. The
Hmm.
game for kids. So yeah, so there's every you're progressing up this thing. Every now and then you get a few boosts up by a ladder, but if you hit a shoot, you're starting over from scratch again.
Right.
And I said, look, there's so many asymmetries in life to where our growth, whether it's our health, our social status, our financial health, whatever it is, you can only grow so fast. But you can go down and shoot with almost no limits as far as how quick
Right.
that
That's a great
happens.
analogy. Yeah. Yeah.
And relative just to the context of sarcopenia, I've seen data saying that even people in their 80s, they can gain some healthy muscle over the course
Hmm.
of a few years. But then in a week of being immobilized, they can lose more than that.
Right.
So the benefit of having that muscle mass protects you against those things which make you lose it so dramatically. So yeah, really, really important point.
Completely agree. Yeah. Yeah.
So I want to talk to you about the environmental side of this, and let me throw my biases out for this one. So I see a lot of arguments pushing us to avoid animal proteins, and really I want to talk about beef on this one. About
Hmm.
beef, one metric that's talked about a lot is the carbon dioxide per kilogram of product, and there's a lot of other gases, a lot of other externalities that are relevant, but that one's brought up quite a bit. And my bias in that I know I'm so much healthier with a wide variety of protein sources, including animal protein, including beef. It would be convenient for me to be able to look past that and
Hmm.
not think that I'm wrecking the planet by doing so. So, but because that's my bias, I want to be even more cautious because it's easier for me to believe that because I want to believe that.
Sure.
So because of that, I'll fight it a little bit more. So yeah, let's just talk a bit about this. And there's the arguments. I've read a few dozen studies on this. I am so far from having any level of confidence or expertise, but it seems to me that it's not really clear at best that grass-fed, thoughtful agriculture may help some sides of this, may not help others. But yeah, let's hear your thoughts and let's talk about this a bit.
Yeah, it's a remarkably complex topic. And so the first public, I guess, debate or commentary I had on this was at California State University Chico back in 2006, where there was kind of a vegan centric group of folks there. And then there was myself and then some people from the Department of Agriculture basically talking about a meat inclusive food system and whatnot. And so I've been thinking about this stuff for a long time, and it's interesting in that it's very easy to paint a picture of animal inclusive agriculture and food systems, and paint it in a pretty scary light. It's remarkably easy to do. And when we embarked on putting together both this book and the film, we spent like 2 years just outlining and fiddling like it is so complex. Like there are whole books written on chapters of what we covered. So how do we do diligence to this stuff, but then also make it accessible for kind of a broad audience and actually do some justice to the science and not just kind of greenwash the whole thing. I will say as a side note, whenever one sees like a vegan documentary film or reads a book, it's kind of a wall of vegan. Like there is never something that doesn't go the vegan way. Like you will live forever, you look amazing, you're going to be morally superior, you're saving the planet, and I will say that in our look at animal inclusive food systems, there's a lot in my opinion, if we did our diligence properly, that is very supportive of this notion of regenerative agriculture ultimately being beneficial for the planetary environment and health and individual human health and whatnot. But there were some things that didn't go our way, like the difference in nutritional value between pastured meat and conventional meat. It's not that big. It's a very small difference, and people more in our community were and are angry at us for this, and they
Huh.
have fought and bickered, and we ended up hiring an independent PhD researcher, and we didn't even tell him that we had arrived at what we thought we were seeing was that there was a tiny basically negligible difference in omega-3 omega-6 content between
I've
pastured meat and
I've
conventional
seen
meat.
that data.
Yeah. And so we had an independent PhD researcher and we said, hey, just go do the best job you can and analyze the delta between pastured meat and conventional meat. And he came back with exactly the same results that we had. Now, that could be that all of us were idiots and all of us did a poor job, or it could be that this is kind of the state of understanding of our
Huh.
our situation. And the interesting thing that I took away from that was that grazing animals are shockingly good at taking low nutrient quality food and foodstuffs, grass and crop residues, and upcycling it into highly nutritious food, for humans and other critters. That's just kind of an aside, but this is still. I just kind of mentioned that we have a few different points there that the more regenerative ag oriented people are cranky at us about because I seriously thought about just lying about this topic. I'm like, nobody reads the research citations, so maybe we just say that it's equal, or that grass-fed meat, pastured meat is better, or what have you. I will say pastured dairy is much more healthy than conventional dairy. It's much more nutritious. Wild caught fish is much more nutritious, but in this story specifically of grazing animals, just not that big of a difference. But what we didn't want to do was have any spots where we really egregiously got the science wrong, so that then kind of a vegan backed researcher could go through, read our citations, and then say, ha, they totally screwed this up. Pastured meat isn't as big a difference as what these guys claim, and then they could invalidate the whole thing. And it's worth mentioning that you really can't find any negative reviews from the vegan scene about our book, which I was kind of stunned about. And I
Huh.
honestly think that we did a good enough job that they actually don't want anybody to even look at the book, look at the film. So they don't even, they're doing kind of an interesting thing, which they just aren't making any noise about it at all. So, and that doesn't prove anything. But, on the specifics of, say, like methane production or carbon equivalents, it's really important for folks to understand that biogenic sources of greenhouse gases really need to be treated differently than what comes out of the tailpipe of a car or out of the engine of a jet. When we're talking about transportation or even heating and electricity based use of fossil fuels, you're taking carbon sources that have been underground for hundreds of millions of years, and you're releasing them kind of en masse in a rather rapid fashion. And that is also part of a cycle. It's kind of a geological timescale type cycle. But when we're talking about biogenic sources, grazing animals, grasslands, the carbon dioxide and the methane that they produce, those plants last year sequestered carbon in their matrix under the ground in the root beds and whatnot by pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and growing using the process of photosynthesis. Then these animals eat these plants, and some of that gets converted into carbon dioxide, just the same way when each time you and I exhale, we're releasing some carbon dioxide. You and I are greenhouse gas emitters. Every living thing is a greenhouse gas emitter, which should cause people to pause for a moment. But then part of the cellulosic fermentation that occurs in these ruminant guts, bacteria are helping to break down the cellulose that is part of grass. It's kind of the non-digestible part of these plants that it would be indigestible to us, but things like cows and termites that have a symbiotic relationship with these bacteria are able to break down. And it's worth mentioning that they break them down into short chain saturated fats. So cows are actually fat fueled, not carbohydrate fueled when you get right down to it. But that is again a whole other side note. But then when they release this methane or carbon dioxide, it goes back into the atmosphere. And in the case of the methane, it has about a 10-year lifespan, about a 10-year half life before it is broken down into carbon dioxide and is re-enters this whole cycle. And in healthy pasture lands where these methane producing animals live, there are methanotrophic bacteria that feed upon and break down the methane. So where this has gotten is that people are so concerned about the greenhouse gas emission part of this story is that they either forgot or never understood that as part of life, this is part of a process. Gases are emitted into the atmosphere, they're as carbon, and it gets recaptured and it gets recycled, and this is a good thing. Where this has become dangerous is that people are so concerned about methane emissions and carbon emissions that things like shellfish, which are now understood to produce absolutely prodigious amounts of methane, and termites, which produce enormous amounts of methane, and their linchpin organisms within their ecosystems, people are now suggesting that these organisms should be eradicated to prevent climate change. And this
Wow.
is insanity. And when I've given this talk at kind of like elementary school type level, the kids totally get it. They're like, "Oh, this totally makes sense." And when I present it to adults, I'm usually left with still kind of like, "Wait, I don't understand this. I'm not getting this full thing." And so I'm not even sure if I'm doing great justice to this, but I think it's critical that people understand the difference between biogenic methane and carbon sources versus, say again, like energy industry and whatnot. The greenhouse gas emissions is a major, kind of like check mark against animal husbandry, specifically beef production. Another thing that's thrown out there is that beef consumes enormous amounts of water. This is again a really interesting kind of misrepresentation of what's going on there. Even in CAFO feedlot animals, they spend 70% of their life on grass. And 96, 98% of the water that is allocated to these animals, it's presented as if this water is being stolen from some other place that could be used in some other way. But this is rain, snow, and other precipitation that just falls on the earth in the areas that the animals live in. So, like, I just moved from Central Texas. There's lots of range animals. You really can't grow anything else around there. It's cactus and thorn bushes and a very minimal topsoil, but it does pretty well for raising grazing animals. And uh, the water that falls on that land when there's grazing animals there, it actually captures and sequesters more of that water in the land because the grasslands are healthier. If you remove grazing animals from grasslands, the grasslands tend to die. These things co-evolve together. So then you end up with these kind of significant erosion scenarios. And it's worth mentioning that you can overgraze an area. That has happened and that still does happen. Too many animals too often on a patch of land will damage it, but too few animals on a patch of land will damage it also. And this is where this holistic management comes in, what they try to do is mimic the predator prey interaction that used to occur when we had huge bison and elk herds and other type of ruminants that would move over the grasslands, and they were trailed by predatory animals, and so they were constantly on the move, and they didn't just stay in one spot and overgraze a particular area. So the water usage piece is really important, but it's also very misrepresented in this whole story, particularly as it relates to cattle. One other piece that is oftentimes raised is that it's portrayed that significant amounts of food that could be consumed by humans are allocated to animals.
The story is feed the people the grains directly rather than feed the cows and eat the cows. And
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. And what's really interesting about that is a detailed analysis of what goes into feeding cows in particular. 86% of what cattle eat is inedible by humans. Most of what is counted as grains that are fed to cows are the leftovers from ethanol production. So, but nobody is raising a stink about making booze or making ethanol to put into cars. But virtually none of the food that's fed to cattle is actually edible by humans. They eat grass, they eat crop residues. So, like a wheat field will be harvested, and then they let animals work their way through the field and upcycle those nutrients and pee and poo. And it's actually a very synergistic, beneficial scenario. The irony in this is that over the last 30 years, Americans consume less beef and more chicken. But if you wanted to make a credible argument about taking food that could feed humans and feeding it to animals, it's pork and poultry, which
hmm,
are exclusively fed on grains and soybean products.
hmm.
But even in Leonardo DiCaprio's film Before the Flood, he it's backed by the National Geographic Society, and it had hundreds of millions of dollars of backing. It's very impactful, and he paints this horrible picture of how damaging grazing animals are to the environment and to the earth and whatnot. And his suggestion is to eat more chicken,
Wow.
and it's insanity. It is literally the opposite of what one would recommend. Like if now there are still people that are making the case that we shouldn't raise any animals, and we kind of address that in the book where again, grasslands must have animals on them to be healthy. This is the symbiotic relationship that they have. So then these folks will say, well, we should just rewild them and just not eat the animals. And it's like, well, okay, how are we going to control the population? Do we reintroduce wolves? Do we allow the mountain lion population to increase? And people aren't real comfortable with that. So there's some, it gets into some really interesting kind of nuanced areas, but eating more chicken is not a solution in that scenario. Like that is an unsustainable process when you look at all the energy inputs and synthetic chemical fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides that are necessary to support the industrial row crop food system that feeds pork and poultry. Up until the 1940s, the main things that people ate in the United States and really kind of globally from a protein perspective, other than seafood, was grazing animals because they are disproportionately good at upcycling nutrients. I forget if it was the Woodrow Wilson era or exactly where it was, but one of the campaign slogans was a chicken in every pot. And
Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
at the beginning of the industrialization of our food system when we started figuring out how to grow grains in mass and really increase the productivity on that side. It was only then that we had enough left over to be able to intensify the production of poultry. Prior to that, chicken and pork played a very secondary and tertiary role in our food systems. Pork was mainly used to deal with kind of food scraps and table scraps and things like that. And then poultry just kind of played a background role as part of the pasture land. They would go through and pick at the cow pies and whatnot and spread them around, and you got some eggs, but they were not a central feature of an ecosystem. You don't see any ecosystems in which something like a chicken is the apex animal. It's always something like caribou or deer or elk or cattle of some form that is kind of the primary organism. And then you have things like pork and different types of fowl that play secondary and tertiary roles. And again, I don't know if that 100% addresses this environmental story, but there's usually the greenhouse gas story, the water use story, and then also the allocation of resources story. Specifically, how many people can we feed, that is
Right.
brought up in this
How
whole thing.
scalable is the idea?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. And I guess to that scalability piece, it's worth mentioning that the vast majority of the land masses that we live on are not amenable to cropping, to raising crops. Unfortunately, many of the places that are very good at raising crops are also rather nice to live, and so we've paved over a lot of those areas. They make
Mm,
great strip malls and building developments and whatnot, but there are all these areas that are really amenable only to some type of grazing. And we have vast tracts of land that, through different legislation, usually backed by vegan and vegetarian, funded groups, that have made it illegal or difficult for people to graze animals on public land. This is kind of more specific to the United States, but it when people ask, can you scale these regenerative systems and feed a global population? I don't know that everybody knows for sure on that story, but we do know that there are massive amounts of land that are unused right now. We also know for certain, and this is a really exciting side of this story, is that properly used grazing animals can and do reverse desertification. So in the film, we highlight a rancher out in the Chihuahuan Desert that has converted 1 million+ acres of desert into grassland, and
wow.
it's amazing. Like, when we drove out there, you have to drive for 5 hours to get to this ranch. So you're just driving through desert, desert, desert. Like, if people are probably more familiar with, like, Las Vegas area, just scrub brush and cactus and whatnot. And then as you get out there, you start seeing something that looks like a tidal wave on the horizon. And as you drive up, it's chest high grass in these
Wow.
areas. And the folks that have lived in this area had kind of folklore that it all used to be a grassland. And then it
Huh.
it it is, for 5 generations, it's been gone. But this guy started using properly managed grazing animals to go through this area. And where once there was hardly any grass growing, each time it did rain, which is rare, but when it would rain, the erosion was just absolutely massive. Now, when you dig down, like, they'll do a cross section in the grass, and the grass roots are 6 feet long, and
Wow.
there's all this carbon getting sequestered there, and it holds just massive amounts of water. Alan Savory has made the case that even if greenhouse gas emissions were 4 or 5 times greater from ruminants than what they are, that just the ability to reverse desertification makes it worthwhile to use them, because this
Mm,
is one of the greatest problems. If an area converts into desert, you're not raising crops, you're not doing anything with it, and you can't recover it just doing cropping. You can recover it using holistically managed grazing animals. So there's all these desertified areas that could be converted into grazing lands, which can also probably be used in some sort of a rotational basis to raise some amount of crops. So that scalability piece, again, I think it's so complex and it's so regionally specific, that I don't know that anybody fully appreciates, like, what the total productivity is. But I suspect it's a lot greater than what anybody really appreciates. And this is kind of the funny thing. Also, it's understood that our current row crop food system has an expiration date on it. This is another piece that would have been great, or we could have lied about this and it would have played really well to our side of the story. There's a claim that we have 60 harvests left before
mm.
all of our
I've heard
topsoil is
that.
gone. We got in and dug and dug and dug and tried to find the research citation with this, and this is quoted in scientific papers. It's ubiquitous within different media reports. And we traced it back to a woman who was giving a talk at the United Nations, and she just offhand said, we
Oh,
probably
wow.
have around like 60 harvests left.
Wow.
So this is again an example where we could have just cited that, and this would have played so powerfully to our position. But we actually said there is actually no scientific basis for this,
Mm,
but it is understood that soil topsoil erosion is a massive problem. And once that topsoil is gone, it's gone. And you're not going to grow food in a lab. You're not like maybe we could dig into the lab grown meat, lab grown, soil deal, but it's this is another example of where we could have really played that to our benefit, but it just isn't true the way it was couched. But it is well understood that the way that synthetic chemical fertilizers tend to bunch the root system right at the surface, because that's where all the nutrients are. The
Hmm.
reason why these grasslands get super deep root beds is that they through a symbiotic process between bacteria and fungi, they mine minerals out of the soil and out of the rock bed that supports the plant, and then the plant helps to feed the bacteria and the fungi.
Hmm.
So if the way that we grow crops now, Alan Savory again, he said the United States, the most precious export that we have is the massive amounts of topsoil that blow away in the wind and that are
Uh-huh.
ending up in our waterways, and then making uh, it unlivable situations in places like the Gulf of Mexico due to the nitrogen blooms, and then also to the kind of silty residue that ends up in the waterways. So again, I know that that was just a ton of stuff and rather random in presentation, but it is so holistic in nature. Like, I think the need to look at this, and I really like the fact that you're like, I'm an omnivore, so I need to expose my biases here. I would similarly caution people. Hopefully, I made a compelling argument that there's something to this, but I would just encourage people. Maybe I'm 80% wrong on this stuff. Maybe, this holistic management thing is 80% right, 80% wrong. But if climate change really is the existential threat that it's being presented as, then we really need to have the nuanced discussions about where the boundaries of reality versus fiction exist. And the way the current kind of cancel culture environment is, it's very, very difficult to have a discussion around this. Like, just suggesting that grazing animals could actually be a benefit in, mitigating or fighting climate change, you're labeled a lunatic and could be deplatformed for this stuff. And again, maybe some of what I'm saying is right, maybe some of it's wrong, but we won't know unless we have a discussion around it. And I think I've detailed a few different popular spots, even like the Leonardo DiCaprio film. The supposition that chicken is more sustainable than beef is ridiculous and easily refutable. But look at the hundreds of millions of dollars that have gone into perpetuating like that narrative as an example.
I just saw a quote yesterday from Oscar Wilde saying that the pure truth is the pure simple truth is not pure and it's never simple.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's a term I heard recently, monocotaxophilia. I bet if you thought for a second, you could digest that. But yeah, so one causal, taxal, so like category, and then love of, so the love of a single
Oh, I like
explanation.
that. Oh, man. I'm gonna write that down really quick.
Monocotaxophilia. It's like the unhealthy attachment to a single explanation. These things are complicated, and a simple story like we've got to not eat cows and everything will be okay. Like, well, that's simple stories. They sell, they scale, they go viral. But yeah, they're the simpler they are, the more apt they are to be wrong. So. And I did read your book and see that level of nuance that you were saying, hey, look, here's some points against our side. And I respected that. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and this is something, and I don't necessarily want to make it an us versus them deal, but, the vegans have a very consistent narrative. It's simple, it's sexy. You'll live forever. You'll look good while you're alive. You'll be morally superior. You won't cause any death. You'll save the planet, and that all sounds great. And then when you really dig into any of those claims, it's like, no, that's not actually accurate at all. And I think that there's a lot of good intention there. But Forbes did a really fascinating piece that made the case that these lab grown meats and the fake meats are not sustainable at all, and that they play incredibly favorably to big ag and biotech, because these are the people that own the IP both on the foodstuffs themselves, but also all of the different inputs that are necessary to make that type of a system work.
Hmm. Yeah, highly recommend the new book, Sacred Cow by Robb. Go pick it up. You can find it anywhere. And I also wanted to get a sense of uh, you know, even more so now, this COVID era may be easing out a bit, but most of what our hanging out ends up being is online. So I want people to get a sense about where they can best connect with you. And you've got the Healthy Rebellion as one good option that way. Is that the best place we should think about? And if so, can you tell us a bit about that? Or
Yeah, so we created a community called the Healthy Rebellion about a year and a half ago, I guess. Google did an interesting algorithmic update, and one day I woke up and my site was receiving 97% less traffic than it had
wow,
received in its recent history, and I was part of an algorithm update, a group of folks kind of in this ancestral health, low carb scene that really took a haircut because, well, there's a lot of speculation about the why, but the reality was that this is absolutely what happened, and so I had a pretty powerful sense that I wanted to decouple from social media and things like that as much as possible. So we created this Healthy Rebellion, which the goal is to liberate 1 million people out of the sick care system, and we have kind of a 3-part process to helping people affect that change. The main thing that I do is the Healthy Rebellion podcast, which my wife and I answer Q&A on each week. I am part of a company called Element. It's an electrolyte company, and I do a lot of blogging for those folks, and that is drinkelement.com. I do have some social media accounts, but I have an assistant that I write up some stuff. She posts it, and I don't go on it at all anymore. Like the toxicity of that stuff has just kind of reached breaking point for me. So I do try to put out some valuable stuff, but I don't really interact there. If folks want to actually interact with me, the podcast or the Healthy Rebellion community is kind of where it happens. Or of course, podcasts like yours.
and we'll get links up to all these things and links to the book. So yeah, Rob, appreciate your time and appreciate your work. And just good to know that others are thinking hard about these things and trying to help us sort it out. So thank you.
Thank you, Doc. I really appreciate it. And platforms like yours are really critical, I think, in this you know, maybe everything that you and I talked about again, maybe 80% of it was right, maybe 20% of it was wrong. If we were to do a redo of this in 5 years and we watched what we talked about and we're like, oh, I had this thing wrong and that thing right. Maybe 20% of it we would find to be off, but it's ever becoming this scenario in which it's difficult, bordering on impossible to just have these conversations around important but thorny topics. And so this podcast medium, I think, is more valuable than ever to just be able to sit down and have these conversations and ask questions. I don't know that we laid out too many emphatic positions around anything, but asked a lot of questions, encouraging people to do a deeper dive and whatnot. So I can't thank you enough for the work you're doing.
And just a somewhat tangential but related, I think that we've gotten to this point to where it seems like we have to be connected by only by the most base level granular belief. And I don't know, I think that our values, our aspirations, they're enough to bridge and create bonds. People can disagree on certain granular levels, but still have connections and still share the same goals and values. And somehow we've got to, if we can't get back to that, there's like no good outcomes that we have in front of us.
Right, right. Yeah, I'm optimistic. I think we have some tough sledding ahead of us, but I'm optimistic we'll get there.
I think so too. All right, Rob, thanks again. Everyone, thanks for being here. Another episode of Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. Dr. C. I'll be back with you real soon. Bye-bye. Hey, Dr. Christianson here. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode. Is there a topic you'd like me to cover? I'd love to hear from you. Just go to Dr. Alan Christianson on Facebook or Instagram, write your question, and use the hashtag #MedicalMyths. Did you find this show helpful? If so, please take a minute and leave us a rating on iTunes so that others can know. Thanks much. I'll be back with you real soon. Bye-bye.